All right, so we'll go ahead and get rolling. It's 5 minutes after, and this ain't Chi Alpha, so I'm going to start on time-ish. If you ever come to Chi Alpha on Tuesday night, don't be shocked if we're still standing around and it's 15 minutes after 7. It's just how we roll. It's all right. Yeah, so we're going to start Genesis chapter 6, which is the fun chapter, right? There's nothing like really confusing in this chapter at all. This doesn't raise any moral or ethical dilemmas for us. What week is this? Anybody know what week are we in? Like 7? Week 7 of Genesis class, and we're in Genesis chapter 6. So we're making more, like, better time than I thought we would. Praise God, huh? Yeah. Does anybody want to take a stab at, like, a recap of some of the major themes that we've seen so far? Anybody feeling brave today? Well, guys, put your hands down. Not everybody at once. It's a lot. It's a lot of people. Nope. Okay, Emily, go ahead.
Being godly in an ungodly manner.
Yeah, that is a major theme in the whole Bible too. Yeah, right on. Yeah.
It's a derivative.
The Bible is derivative. That's great. Yeah. You retained one thing from the first day, and I'm loving it. Yeah, it's great. So. Okay, yeah. So at this point in the story, right? We saw the fall of man, which was a big bummer, right? Frowny face forever there. And then after we get through the whole creation narrative, we get the Eden narrative, and then the fall of man and God's prophecy, right? We're looking for the snake crusher, the seed of a woman, the person that's going to come along and set everything right, okay? And then we get to Genesis chapter 4, and we're introduced to Cain, right? The firstborn of Adam and Eve, and we're like, hey, maybe this will be the seed of the woman. It's definitely not, right? Really bad. It's a big frowny face through chapter 4, right? Because we see the line of Cain and how horrible it is. Like, all his descendants are pretty much the epitome of the worst, right? We get to the 7th from Adam through Cain, and what we find is like the archetype of a bad guy for the Hebrew Bible, right? Lamech. He's like bragging about murdering children and stuff. He's not exactly the nicest person that you ever meet. Okay, and then we wrap that up with the statement right at the end. I think it's verse 27 or 28. But it says, "In those days, men began to call on the name of the Lord." Right, and so now we have a distinction between people that walk with God and people that don't. And that statement is our transition into Genesis chapter 5, where we're introduced to the line of Seth, right, which is the third born or so from Adam and Eve. Y'all tracking? Everybody with me? Yeah. And then there wasn't a whole lot to pull out of Genesis chapter 5, except for a lot of questions about what the Bible thinks of numbers and counting, and if those ages are actual or not. And if you remember, we went over that and said probably not. They're probably symbolic in some way, just because we went over the intertextual evidence and stuff in there. But the big thing we wanted to point out was how the 7th from Adam through Seth was the polar opposite of the 7th from Adam through Cain, right? We had Lamech, the child murderer dude, polygamist, brags about it. And then on the other side, we have Enoch, right, who lived for 365 years and then was no more, right? God just took him, right? And so what that means is that's supposed to show us because the 7th, right, is going to be the epitome. They're going to be like the personification of all the traits of those two lines, right? And we see Enoch is godly. And so the line of Seth is godly. They're the ones we're looking for, right? So we're looking through this line of Seth, okay? And we get to the 10th, and that's Noah, right? And the number 10 represents completion. Okay, so we're looking now at the story of Noah. That's what we're going to dive into. So narratively speaking, the question we need to be asking, is Noah the seed of the woman? Is he going to be the one that fulfills the prophecy and sets everything right? Okay, we all on the same page? Yeah? Are we excited to dive into this? Yeah, all right. I don't believe any of you. So the good thing is, with warm weather, it makes it a cold brew coffee time, which is my favorite time, along with regular coffee time. So, all right. So Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, and yeah, we'll just read through this and then we'll begin to break it down because it's a tough first 5 verses here. Okay. As usual, I'm going to be reading out of the NASB, and it's more of a direct word-for-word translation. So it may vary ever so slightly from what you have in front of you. Okay. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. All right, so this doesn't bode well for anyone, right? This isn't exactly a pick-me-up right now. Okay, so where do you want to start with this one? Should we start with the whole sons of God, like getting it on with the daughters of men? That's a little weird, right? Okay, so we'll start there, yeah. That's the part where everybody usually has questions. I know I do. So the phrase son of God in Hebrew is literally ben Elohim, right? And there's multiple ways that we can interpret this, okay? A plain reading would say that sons of God would mean angelic or spiritual beings, okay? There's also an interpretation that says that the sons of God mean those who walk with God. So that would be the line of Seth, right? And then there's another interpretation that says sons of God is a royal title that was claimed by kings in ancient times. Like even the ancient Israelite kings would claim the title as son of God, right? So we're going to try and break that down and look at which of these 3 kind of interpretations of the phrase sons of God probably fits the narrative best, okay? So this is going to get a little technical because this is really confusing, right? This brings up all kinds of questions about the nature of reality for me. So first, so the Sethite view is the view that this is referring to people that walk with God, which would be, in the narrative context, the people from Genesis chapter 5, like that family, okay? So that lineage would be the lineage that's carrying the prophetic seed of a woman, snake crusher hope. Does that make sense? And so it would make sense that God's really jealous of keeping that line pure. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So the idea here is that there's a continuation of inherited roles passed down from Adam through Seth. Does that make sense? So Cain was disinherited, and Seth became the heir of Adam's role as the priest king of the earth. Okay, y'all remember? Everybody with me? Okay, so this idea was actually held by a lot of the more like classical theologians and a lot of the Reformationists. So St. Augustine, anybody heard of him? That's how he interpreted this. John Calvin, Martin Luther, these giant, big, important theologians in history, they interpreted this as sons of God being the Sethite line. Does that make sense? So that's that's a lot to really take on and say that you're wrong. You know, when it's like Martin Luther, the guy that started the Protestant Reformation, says that. You know, Augustine is a saint. So can you argue? Are you allowed to argue with him? You know, And then, John Calvin has like an entire like school of theology that he founded called Reformed theology. It's hugely influential and has probably influenced you and your thinking without you even knowing it, right? So, who are we to kind of argue with these people? Well, I'm a jerk, so I'm going to argue with them. So the problem, I think, with the Sethite view is the phrasing in verses 1 and 2, where why would they make the distinction between the sons of God and the daughters of men? Right? If they're essentially of the same nature, why would you make that distinction? Does that make sense? And then also, the meaning of the word man would have to change, right? So in verse 1, where it says, "Now it came about when man began to multiply on the face of the earth," right? "And the daughters were born to them." Men there would have to mean humanity. You tracking? Okay. And then verse 2, where it says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful," men there would have to mean only the descendants of Cain. You tracking? That to me seems a little bit difficult. I don't think that that's necessarily an easy interpretation to have, right? When within like 2 sentences, the meaning of a word changes radically from humanity to just this group. Tracking? Yeah? Okay. So to me, that's the biggest problem with the Sethite view. Okay? Is that word meaning has to change rather rapidly. Not saying that doesn't happen in the Bible or in language at all, but what I am saying is it makes it a little bit difficult. Okay? So next interpretation, right? The ancient kings, right? Let's say this was a royal title claimed by a royal lineage, right? So a couple issues is that we know that the people that held that title, Son of God, ancient kings of Israel, actually did adopt polygamy like Lamech. And it seems counterintuitive to me that they would have a guy like Lamech in Genesis chapter 4 and totally dog him and be like, "Look at this guy, he's trash," only to have that title apply to somebody that was doing the same very thing. Yeah? Okay. There's a whole lot of background I can give on that about, there's like tons of times in Genesis between chapter 6 and 8 that we're told specifically that Noah had one wife, right? And I think that's to emphasize that this line that Noah comes from, this godly line, only has one wife. They're not polygamists, right? And that's actually where we get our standard of monogamy, okay? In First Timothy, Paul is talking about the role of a bishop and says that they should be the husband of one wife. That's where he's pulling this from. Is he's saying, hey, look, in Genesis, one of the ways to know somebody was godly was how many wives did they have. You see that? Everybody tracking? Okay. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, I didn't understand my own notes. That's always troubling, right? Are y'all encouraged by that or discouraged? I don't know. One of the cases for the ancient king's view is in verse 3, chapter 6, verse 3, where God says, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years." So the argument for ancient kings is that God doesn't say he's mad at angels, right? God's not saying he's mad at spiritual beings. He's specifically saying that he's mad at flesh, at man, right? So that's a pro, right? Mark it in the pro column of this. Actually, there's a good number of modern Hebrew scholars that think that this is the appropriate view to take, is that it's talking about ancient kings, okay? And, historically speaking, that was a really common phrase, a really common title for a king to give himself, right? Like in ancient Egypt, for example, they considered themselves God incarnate. They were like, the Pharaoh was the incarnation of the sun god Ra, right? So it's not like a leap for an ancient king to call themselves the son of God. Okay? All right, so the last option, right, is that sons of God means or refers to angelic beings, right, spiritual beings. So in my humble opinion, and I totally could be wrong because I just named off like a ton of people that are way smarter than me and way holier than me that believe differently, okay? But in my opinion, this is the one that fits the best. First off, Son of God is a common phrase used for divine beings. We can see it in Job chapter 1, verse 6. It says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them also." In Job chapter 1, you'll remember that's this kind of heavenly court things going on. Like you're in God's I don't want to say courtroom. Throne room. There's the word I'm looking for. Right? And he's just like, he has all his peeps there, and they say, sons of God. Okay? So that phrase is referring to the spiritual beings present at God's council. You can also see this in Job 38:7, Psalm 82:6. These are things you can look up on your own, right? We also know that the phrase Elohim was also used to mean a spiritual being, okay? The most glaring example of this comes from 1 Samuel chapter 28. If that doesn't just immediately pop into your mind, I'll tell you about it, right? I know you all have like 1 Samuel memorized, right? Everybody does. It's such a great one. This is the part where like Saul, right, he's gone off the rails, and he goes to the old school way of saying it is the Witch of Endor, right? He goes to this occultist, what's the word? Medium. There it is, spiritual medium. I haven't had enough coffee today. He goes to this medium, and he's like, hey, conjure up the spirit of Samuel, because Samuel the prophet has died, okay? And he says, do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up out of the earth, right? So the phrase divine being there, right, is the literal word Elohim, okay? And I kind of love this episode because the lady seems surprised. Like, if this is her job, why is she surprised that it's working? Anyway, so it's just like whenever you see like that a psychic got arrested, you're like, shouldn't you have? No? Anyway. Okay, so the phrase Elohim, the word Elohim can mean a divine being, okay? Also, the phrase son of can also mean in Hebrew from the class of, okay? What do I mean by that? In 1 and 2 Kings, Elijah and Elisha establish a school of prophets that they call themselves the sons of the prophet. They weren't the literal sons of Elijah and Elisha, but they called themselves sons of the prophet. We see this like Amos in his book. In chapter 7, he says, I'm not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet. He's saying, he says, for I'm a herdsman and a grower of sycamore figs. So he's saying like, hey, I haven't been trained in that prophetic school. I'm not one of them, right? And then also just through the books of 1 and 2 Kings, you can read like the sons of the prophet were doing this, meaning that they are a prophet. They're from that class. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Are we too far afield? Or is this helping pull things in focus? Okay. Another, if you ever want to just be really confused by the Bible, read Psalm 82. Okay? Psalm 82 is just a really crazy psalm. But in that psalm, God is speaking to his divine counsel. He's speaking to the heavenly throne room scene, right? And he's accusing them of doing wrong, which is crazy to think about. And one of the things he says is, nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any one of the princes. You see that? So God is speaking to spiritual beings, right? And he's saying, you guys are going to die. Right? It literally, in the beginning of the psalm, it says that God is speaking to gods. Ye are gods. You are gods. Sorry, I don't know why I shifted into KJV right there. Forgive me. Every now and again, the King Jimmy just comes out. So there's no question that God in Psalm 82 is speaking to spiritual beings, and he's also telling them that they can die. Okay? Does that make sense? So all of that makes me think that this sons of God is spiritual beings. And that's what the Bible's talking about. This also seems to be the way that the New Testament authors thought of this text as well. In Jude 6 and in 2 Peter 2, they refer to this moment where angels sin. Okay? So, while this isn't necessarily slap-bang proof that what I'm saying is right, I do feel like the majority of the evidence is for the interpretation that these sons of God that were knocking boots with the daughters of men, right, were angelic beings. Now, what does that mean for us? I don't know. That's just one of those uncomfortable kind of moments that the Bible presents us with that we just have to deal with. Like it's just there, right? So if that makes you uncomfortable, brings up too many questions, then feel free. Like the other views, the Sethite view and the ancient kings view, those views are perfectly valid and does diffuse the tension here. Does that make sense? But for me personally, just using intertextual evidence from the Bible and just letting the Bible interpret itself leads me to believe that this is just a really weird and uncomfortable moment in the Bible that we have to deal with. Okay? Y'all still with me?
Yeah.
That was a lot of talking about like 3 words, right? Welcome to Bible study. Okay. I can't remember where I get into. Okay, that's later. Yeah. Dang it, I want to skip to that, but I won't. We'll go through, stick to my notes. You're welcome, Emily. Sorry. Okay, this kind of came up last week. Remember when we were talking about the age, the lengths of age in Genesis 5, and how you have like Adam living for like 980 years, and like Noah's dad, the good Lamech, like living for 777. We're like, what's with these guys' ages, right? And one of the questions that was raised was, couldn't these ages be literal, right? They literally lived that long. Couldn't that be true? Because later, God says, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. I'm going to limit his years to 120. Okay? We've already kind of touched on that when I answered that question, so I won't spend too much time here. But one of the big problems with that is immediately after the flood, the son of Shem lives for like 400 and something years. So did God just forget? You know, just like, oops, my bad. We'll catch up later, right? If that's the case, it's a couple more generations before like lifespans get shrunk into proper order, right? So what the traditional interpretation of this has been is that 120 years was how long it took Noah to build the ark. So God is saying, I'm going to tell Noah to start on this ark. It's going to take him 120 years. So I'm going to give humanity 120 years to repent. If at any moment they repent and turn from their wicked ways, I'm not going to send this flood. And that's the implication of this statement. Yeah? So 1 Peter, the reason why I feel like I can say this, right, is 1 Peter 3:20 says, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. So I feel like that's what Peter is referencing. And that's what seems to fit, especially when we pull in what, Genesis chapter 5 and then Genesis 10. When we get there, we'll see more of it about lifespans. Does that make sense? Okay. So we'll just stop there because that was like super information dense. Does anybody have any questions so far? Yeah.
If in Jude, like, it says that the angels, who fell were kept, like, in eternal bonds, how are they able to interact on earth?
Yeah, that goes back to that.
Old question.
Yeah, no, that goes back to the question of when did the angels fall? You know? Some could say like, yeah, they fell like before this moment, then narratively it wouldn't make any sense. But it just seems to me that this is the moment that the angels fall. Does that make sense? So then Jude's statement would line up and say afterwards.
Okay. Cool.
Also, like Jude and 2 Peter, in their statements about this sons of God and daughters of men thing, they're also pulling from a book that was really, really important. I went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to mention this, but really important in the Second Temple period of Judaism. It's called the Book of Enoch. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's pretty interesting. They considered it a valuable book, but they didn't consider it like canon. They didn't consider it Bible. Does that make sense? So like the way that I would talk about Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Hey, this is a great book. You should read it. It's not the Bible, right? It's not truth, but it helps illuminate truth. So there is so much like extra biblical writings out there that can help you kind of understand how people interpreted the Bible more than it can help you understand the Bible itself. Does that make sense? And Enoch falls in that realm. There's also second and third Enoch that get really crazy, where like Enoch gets promoted and becomes like a super angel and becomes like almost like a superhero type character. It gets crazy. Some of those books are really funny like that. But Enoch was a very important book to the Second Temple period, which is the version of Judaism that Jesus grew up in, all the apostles were grown up in. So when Jude is writing and when 2 Peter is writing and they mention this Genesis 6 narrative, they're using the book of Enoch to help them understand it. At the time, well, throughout history, it wasn't uncommon for someone to write a commentary about a historical event or some kind of scripture and pose as someone within the narrative. Does that make sense? So the book of Enoch is written from Enoch's perspective, and what most scholars believe it is that it was a rabbi that was trying to help people understand Genesis chapter 6, right? And so he was writing from the perspective of Enoch. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you want, I mean, you can look it up. I don't really recommend it, and don't like get into it too much because it gets weird. But I mean, if you're bored, you have free like Thursday or something, go for it, you know. Any other questions so far?
Feel free to tell me this is too far in the woods. So if he's talking about that one being, do you mean on the one where it says 120 years, the time from when he told him that the flood was going to come, an actual 120 years when the flood came? That lines up with Noah's 500, and then he was 600, it says, whenever the flood actually came.
Oh yeah.
So would that lend to it being years, or, I don't know, because I haven't heard it that way before. I'm interested in it.
I don't know. I haven't spent a whole lot of time like parsing out the numbers in here, simply because I just tend to think Genesis is using the numbers in a symbolic manner. That's why I haven't dug into that, but I mean, feel free. I haven't really thought about it. That's a great question, though. I can come back next week and try and have an answer. Yeah. But good questions. Sorry I couldn't answer it. Okay, so let's, you want to talk about the Nephilim? Anybody? Y'all down for that? All right. These are the weird ones, right? We're just like, what does this even mean? Okay. Nephilim. Okay. So depending on how you interpret the phrase sons of God is going to greatly affect how you interpret Nephilim. Okay? Or Nephilim. So in the King James, this word was originally translated as giants. And that's kind of the image that we typically have when we hear that word, right? Because we've all been in Sunday school with the felt board, right? And we're like, oh, look, giants. Okay? I'm sure we all sounded like that. This interpretation of the word comes from the conquest narrative, right? Or the Exodus narrative, where the Israelites are scouting out the land. Do you remember that part? They send 12 scouts in, and only 2 of them were faithful, and the other 10 were like cowards and lying, right? So the giants' interpretation of the word Nephilim comes from the unfaithful scouts. Okay? So in Numbers 13:33, they said, there also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are part of the Nephilim. That's a parenthetical. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Okay? So these, remember, are the 10 scouts that are like, there's no way we can conquer this land. We can't do it. And so their report is unfaithful. Right? They're an unreliable narrator. Does that make sense? So that's where that idea comes from. But Joshua and Caleb did not seem to think that there were giants in the land. Right? Remember, Joshua is the guy that takes over for Moses. He's like, if anybody's going to be speaking truth, it's Moses' right-hand man. And he doesn't say anything about giants. Tracking?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the word itself and not the interpretation so much. The word in Hebrew comes from a root word, nephal, which means to fall. So a Nephilim is a fallen one, person that has fallen. So what could that be referring to, right? That's going to mean like someone that is not walking with God. Okay? It's not like somebody that trips. You see what I'm saying? This is someone that's morally fallen, is what the Bible is referring to. Okay? You can also, if you want this little side note, you can also read it to where the Nephilim are present during this time, but not necessarily the product of the union of the sons of God and daughters of men, right? But the Bible seems to imply that they're that product. So for me, the key to understanding this is the phrase mighty men or men of renown, which is used to describe the Nephilim, right? So right there at the end of verse 4. Y'all tracking? Everybody still with me? Okay. So the term mighty men is Giborim, and the phrase men of renown literally means men of the name, meaning men that wanted to make a name for themselves. Okay? So there are a lot of parallels in verse 4 to what historians would call the heroic age. Okay, so the heroic age is that period in history where we're not really sure that anything is real. We just have a lot of stories, okay? Some of them are quite fantastical. But everyone else in history that is talking about these events treated these events as if they were true. So we just kind of have to say they are. Does that make sense? History's such a sketchy discipline, I'm sorry. But, I got my degree in it. Only cost me like $25,000. It's fine. Right? So this heroic age is the mythical times when like ancient cities or peoples were founded or established. And from like an academic and archaeological point of view, there's almost no way to really refute these claims or approve them. Okay? So an example of this would be like the city of Athens was founded by Theseus, right? And there was a competition between Athena and Poseidon over who they would name the city over, right? And you can guess which one, right? They're like, Poseidon, what will you give us? And he goes, salt water. And they're like, that's crap. And then Athena, what do you give us? She's like, how do you like olives? And they're like, we're down. and so they named it Athens, right? Or the story of how Rome was founded. You know, the twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, were raised by a wolf, which is really weird. But sure, then they founded Rome, okay? Or if we go even further back, is the city of Babylon, depending on what source you read, was founded by Enki or Marduk. We all know those people, right? They're like demigods, okay? Like, so in the mindset of the time, someone that you would describe as a mighty man or a man of renown, somebody that was the product of the union of spiritual beings and flesh, would be somebody along the lines of a Hercules. You see what I'm saying? Hercules was a demigod, right? Zeus, his dad turned into like, I think his mom like, Zeus turned into like a swan or something, and his mom was like, oh, I want a piece of that. And then you have Hercules. Look, Greek myth is really crazy. Just, Zeus was horrible. Anyway, so what it seems to be is that since so many of the cultures around them, all right, so many of the cultures around the Hebrews at the time were claiming that either their cities or their royal lineages or their entire people groups were founded by these demigods and these unions of spiritual and flesh. What it seems is that they're taking a pot shot at them. And they're saying, hey, Marduk that started Babylon, yeah, he's a mighty man, but they're fallen. They're Nephilim. Do you see that? And given the overall tone of the Bible and its view of the cultures around it, right, I think it kind of fits. I don't think it disagrees with the overall tone of the Bible, okay? So at the very least, what we can say is that the Nephilim are prideful men that rely on their own strength and follow the way of Cain. They're violent men. They're men that found cities, just like Cain founded a city. Now, tracking? This idea will come back up in Genesis chapter 10, and we'll revisit it and pull a little bit more out. But as far as we are now, I think that's good. I mean, does anybody have any questions about Nephilim? So, I mean, if you want, you can still think of them as giants. But the idea that you're supposed to have of them is that they're some kind of unholy combination of spiritual being and flesh, right, that founds these enemy cities that are violent and rapacious. Yeah? Y'all still with me? Okay, praise God. Okay, now this is the part I wanted to skip to before, but I felt like we had to address the whole like weirdness in the first 4 verses here. But okay, so this blew my mind. I was reading a book by John Walton, and he pointed this out. Okay, Genesis chapter 6, narratively, right, in the story, function as an inversion of Genesis chapter 3. Okay? The first 4 verses of Genesis chapter 6 functions as a narrative inversion of Genesis chapter 3. And that's like a really big statement with really big words, right? But I hope I'll explain it well because I get really excited about it, right? So there is this key phrase that is established in Genesis chapter 3 that you need to have stamped on your mind, okay? Anytime you read the Bible, you need to be looking for this theme. Okay, remember the idea of themes and how they're played upon, right? This is a major one, okay? This is like the Imperial March, Darth Vader's song in Star Wars. You're going to hear it all the time, okay? So the idea of look, desire, and take. So Eve, when she rebelled, right, when she decided, no, God, I know better than you, even though you created everything and I've been alive for like 24 hours, right? She looked at the tree, right, saw that it was good for fruit, desired it, and then took it. Look, desire, take. That logical pattern is, I mean, like, it's so important, okay? So, there's, do I have the box? Yes. Okay, that helps so much. Okay, thank you. Emily, thank you so much. I keep on forgetting to tell her where we're at, and so it comes around to, like, Wednesdays, and I'm like, hey, hey, Emily, I know this is totally not your job and you have plenty of other things to do, but you want to make slides real quick? So, yeah, anyway, give her a high five anytime you see her. Okay, so if you look at the parallel links here between these verses, you can see, so in Genesis 3:6 it says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was desirable, right? Parallels with verse 2 in Genesis 6 says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, right? So the fruit, we see it and it's a delight to the eyes. It's beautiful and desirable, right? Just like the sons of God see the daughters of men were beautiful and desirable, okay? And then it continues, she took from its fruit and ate. And then on the parallel side, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Do you see that parallel? It's like once you see it, you're like, how did I miss this? Right? It's there. It's blaring. It's blinking. Okay? And this is drawn a lot from John Walton. He has a whole series called the Lost World series. It's not about Jurassic Park. It's the lost world of Genesis 1, the lost world of Eden, the lost world of the flood. There's like 9 books in the series, and I highly recommend that you get one. Right? You don't buy them new. Buy a used copy because they're like $3 plus $2 shipping from Amazon, and it will just blow your mind. It's incredible. So I really encourage you to grab one. And if you get any of them, you'll probably be like, Scroggins is a fraud. He's just reading this stuff, because that's exactly what I'm doing. Okay? Make no mistake about it. So what we see in this narrative switch, right, is in Genesis 3, it can be seen as humanity, trying to ascend to the throne of God and take his place in judging right and wrong. Right? That's what that whole tree is about. They want to know what's right and wrong. They want to decide what's right and wrong. Okay? Genesis 6 is an inversion of heaven, right? Rebels in heaven trying to pull earth up to them. So one is earth aspiring up, and the other is heaven pulling up. Does that make sense? Okay? So the motivation for this is that the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 knew that something had been lost when Eden failed. Right? When man rebelled in Eden, there was no longer a place where heaven and earth overlapped. And that was the whole point of the Garden of Eden. So what we have is these angelic beings, these sons of God in Genesis 6, trying to recreate a place where heaven and earth overlap. Right? Emily, what was that theme that you talked about?
Being godly in an ungodly manner.
Right. They're trying to achieve the ends of God without God's character, without God's blessing, without God's asking. They're trying to do what God wanted in disobedience. You see that? And so what these angelic beings were trying to do is recreate a place of Eden. But we see in the manner in which they do it that it's expressly going to fail because it follows the saw and desired and the take thing. The same thing that befell Eve befell them. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, narratively, what we can say is that we now know for certain there are more spiritual beings involved in the rebellion against God than just that one serpent. Okay? And so now, what God has on his hands is dual rebellion. Not only is mankind and humanity rebelling against him on earth, but there's spiritual beings rebelling against him in heaven. Yeah? So, look how high that deck is stacked against God. So narratively, the stakes are higher than they've ever been at this point. It looks like everything's about to come crashing down. Yeah? Are y'all still with me? Yeah. Oh, okay. So we can pause for questions. Anyone? And if you haven't noticed, these pause for questions are just an excuse for me to drink coffee.
So they made assumptions.
Maybe. Who knows? Yeah. Okay, let's see, what time is it? Okay, we got a little more time. Man, those first 4 verses are just nuts, right? Yeah. There's a lot there. And then there's a lot of confusing stuff there, too. Okay. So, let's continue. We're going to start this section. We're going to start it. There's going to be a lot of questions. For me, the next 3 verses, 5 through 8, is like the real can of worms. You thought Nephilim and sons of God and daughters of men, you thought that was a can of worms. I think this is actually the bigger one, okay? So we'll just dive into it, and when we run out of time, we'll just pick it back up next week. Yeah? Okay. So, starting in verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. What a joyful story. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So this is not like the happiest moment, right? We thought Genesis 3 was bad. We thought Genesis 4 was bad. Genesis 5 gives us a little hope. And then bam, we hit this, right? That's like you're building up energy. You know, you're about to wrap up your run. You know, you're on the last quarter mile of your 5-mile morning jog, and you step in a pothole and break your leg. That's kind of where we're at right now. Just like, wham! Whoa! What happened? Was that a little much? Y'all just recoiled. Has that happened to somebody? Is that like, anyway, okay. Okay, so here we have now arrived at this incredibly landmark moment in the history of the universe. Okay? This is the first time in the entire Bible that God shows emotion. Right? He doesn't show us any emotion previously. Through the fall, all of that stuff, it never says that he's sad or angry. Here, we have emotion directly stated. Okay? And what is that emotion? Grief. Intense sorrow and grief. So, remember the law of first mention. Remember the law of first mention. So that means anytime God shows emotion, we need to remember this moment as the moment that emotion for God was introduced. So many of us will have this idea of a wrathful and angry God. And he's just like, he's winding up. He's about to, he's got his hand raised, the chancla, But that's not him at all. The image of God that we're supposed to have is somebody that's got his head in his hands weeping. Because that's where we are as a race, as a people. Is we've brought God to tears. Not out of joy, but out of pain. So the phrase about humanity, the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. There's this author that I love to read. He was a journalist and got saved later in life. Malcolm Muggeridge says, the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable reality, but at the same time the most intellectually resisted fact. Right? We all know people are jerks. We all know people are jerks, but for some reason, there's just this cognitive dissonance that as a collective humanity, we don't want to believe that. Right? Our personal interactions all back that up, but when we collectivize that idea, we're like, no, people are good, it'll be fine. It's not fine, it's never fine. Right? Like, all you have to do is like peruse a history book and skim the chapter titles, and you'll notice, like, oh, things not great. Got it. Okay? So we're going to dive in and zero in on a couple things here. In verse 6, I think is one of the most complicated verses in the Bible. Okay? For me, it's one of the most challenging verses in the Bible. says, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved to his heart. Okay? The word for sorry here, that he was sorry, in other translations of the Bible, it might have repented. And he repented that he had made man. Did any of your Bibles have that? Okay. The word here is this Hebrew word nacham. Okay, it's one of those throat-clearing words, you know? Like if you're being affected by all the pollen like I am, you'll say it a couple times a day. Nacham, okay? And then you can breathe, it's fine. So, nacham, the root for the word nacham is a Hebrew onomatopoeia. Do you remember what an onomatopoeia is? Anybody remember that? That was like the big word. Like if you spelled it right in my 7th grade English class, you got an extra 5 points on your test. I didn't spell it right. But an onomatopoeia is a word that simulates the sound, right? Pop, bang. Those are onomatopoeia. So nacham, the root that it comes from, because remember how Hebrew is constructed, it all comes from these little roots, right? Is an onomatopoeia that means to draw in the breath or sigh. Like a... How many of you are parents? How many of you have made that sound when you walk in from home and see what your children have done to your house? You know what I'm saying. If I don't take a deep breath right now, CPS is going to be here in like 15 minutes. Right? That's kind of the idea. So this word in Hebrew, nacham, there's no English word that really captures its meaning. And that's one of the troubles with translation, right? Is sometimes there's just words that you can't translate. There's no good word for it. And so this word nacham in Genesis 24, it can mean like comfort, right? So Isaac, when his mother dies in Genesis chapter 24, he nachams himself over the death of his mother. Okay? In Genesis 27, when Esau realizes that Jacob has betrayed him, he nachams himself with plans to kill Jacob. Right? So this word can mean like a comfort, but it can also mean a repentance, a changing of the mind, or a consolation. Right? So God is consoling himself. This pain will be over. I'm going to undo what I did. Do you see that? So that begs the question, did God change his mind? And if God changes his mind, holy smokes, I'm talking about a can of worms here, right? The next word that's important here, I think, only adds to that level of, hey, this is really important. We need to consider this, right? Is when it says that he was shocked or grieved to his heart. The word grieved here is the Hebrew word atzav, and it means to be deeply hurt. The root that it comes from originally means to cut or to carve. So he felt like he was stabbed in the back. So, I think if I were a smarter man and trying to translate this, I would almost translate it as God felt stabbed in the back, and he was so hurt and shocked by what he saw that he gasped. Nacham. Right? I mean, think of the tragedy that is constantly befalling him. In Genesis 3, his whole plan is ruined. The priest kings betray him. He has 2 people, right? And he's just like, you had one thing to do, right? And they're like, no, I'm going to do it, right? And then their kids murder each other. Like Generation 2, Humanity 2.0 murders each other, right? And then just further down the line starts celebrating it. And then in Genesis 6, his own heavenly court rebels against him and joins in the rebellion of man, or joins in the rebellion of this other spiritual being that is out there. Do you see that? So the level of grief that God feels is intense, and it's unrelenting. And so we just see like the tragic and continual pattern of humanity apart from God. First you sin, then your sin destroys your family, then your family's sin destroys your nation. Your father's an alcoholic, the son grows up violent and angry, and then becomes an agent of chaos and destruction in society. We see this played out over and over and over and over. And how does God feel about it? He's so hurt that he wishes he'd never made you. So, the driving emotion in the flood story from God's perspective is not anger, but grief. He comforts himself by saying that the hurting won't go on. I'll have to put a stop to this hurt. Do you see that? And we can kind of juxtapose this with like other flood narratives from ancient cultures, namely like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the gods send a flood on the earth because mankind were being too noisy at night and keeping them awake. Right? So we have other flood narratives where the floods are from capricious gods that have gripes and quibbles that they decide to settle on a cosmic level, versus our God who sends a flood on the earth because of what we are doing to ourselves and to him. Do we see that? Okay. So, in light of all that, do we have any questions so far? Nothing? Really? Okay. Did I do a good job explaining it? Oh, praise God. Okay. I was like gearing up for the whole like, did God change his mind? Did God change his mind conversation, you know? Which, you know, I think yes. I think he repented. Like, he nachamed himself. He wished that he had never made humanity. Right? And if you want, we can walk through some other scriptures where, you know, Abraham changes God's mind. Moses changes God's mind. It happens a lot. There's another one in when God's talking to the priest Eli. He's like, hey, I know how I promised your family that y'all would be priests forever, but you guys are so terrible, I'm rescinding that promise. Like he says it in, what is that, 1 Samuel. You know, you can read that yourself if you like. It's like chapter 3, I want to say. Don't quote me on it. But anyway. Okay, so then we have that framework of just awful, right? Where God is weeping on the throne of heaven because of what we've done to ourselves and to his creation, right? And then we come to this line, but Noah. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Okay? And if that but wasn't there, your but wouldn't be here. Right? That's my favorite, another cheesy joke, you know. You're welcome to use it in Bible study and look really cool like I do right now, right? Okay. So, narratively, what is the question that we should be asking of Noah? Is he the guy? Yes. Is he the guy? Because it can't get much more bleak than God saying, you know what, I wish I'd never done this. Right? So narratively speaking, we're like, Noah, he's the seed of the woman. He's the snake crusher. He's the 10th from Adam through Seth. He's fulfilling all of the things. Right? So let's see what happens. There's this really fun chart here. Where if you have your notes with you, like if you don't have the notes with the lines on the side, it's like on mine, it's like page 47. But the number of ways that Adam and Noah line up in the story is not an accident, right? We are supposed to look at Noah as a second Adam. He's like a reset on Adam. We're going to try this humanity thing again. You see that? So we can see Noah and Adam both stated they walk with God. They both are mediates of a covenant with God. Like that means a deal. They broker a deal with God, right? They're both called blessed. They both serve a special role in creation. They're both told to be fruitful and multiply, which is that Edenic blessing, right? They're both caretakers of animals. Adam gets to name them and Noah gets to collect them. So Noah's like a Pokemon guy, I guess. Right? They both have 3 sons that are highlighted. Adam's sons are slightly better than Noah's, I'd say. But only slightly. Right? They both have a son that falls, Cain and then Ham, right? They're both described as workers of the ground, like farmers, right? Both of their sins are connected to fruit. Noah gets drunk on wine, and Adam obviously ruins everything. They both are bringers of animals. They're both considered priests over creation, right? And they're both placed in a special realm. Adam's placed in the garden, and Noah is placed in the ark. See all these like narrative things that are just showing that they're getting you ready and how we're supposed to view Noah, and they're trying to build the hope that you have that Noah will be the guy to set everything right. Okay? And some of that tension is obviously lost because here we are like 8,000 years later or whatever, and things are still awful. So, you know what I mean? Right? We know how this turns out. So it's kind of hard to carry that tension. Yeah. Trying to decide. Do you want to keep going? We got like we do like another 10 minutes or so? Or do you just want to call it now and y'all can kind of talk and ask questions amongst yourselves or with me, whatever? Man, y'all are the most interactive people I've ever met in my life.
Is a lot more information.
It's always a lot of information. I'll tell you, we'll just stop here in verse 9, okay? And that'll give you all time to read through the flood narrative, right? Because we all want to, right? We're all going to read Genesis chapter 6. So the next week we can have a good idea of what we're walking into, right? Yeah, I believe in you. Okay. So yeah, love you guys. And if you have any questions, I'll be free.